gone? Well, hang on a second. So she said, well, let's go down to the reading room. They might be down there. So we went. If you've ever been in the archives, there's a large, long room with tables. And there was one table that had a cart. They wheel in the documents in boxes on carts. And I couldn't see behind it, but I went around to look, and there was a petite Japanese American woman going through some files. And I thought, oh my goodness, she's beaten me to this. But I introduced myself and I said, can I ask what you're working for? And she said, well, I'm the head researcher for the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, which I'd never heard of. And this was an agency set up by Congress in 1980 to do a study of the internment. And her name was Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga. And it turned out that she had been interned herself as a teenager and sent to this desolate camp in Arkansas. And she had made a career really out of doing all the research on the internment cases. And then she'd been hired by the commission. So I said to her, well, I'll tell you what, I'm going to look for the material on the cases, which is not here. But if I do find it, why don't we share what we find with each other? And she said, that's a great idea. So I went over right across the street, the Justice Department building, which I'm sure you've seen on TV many times lately, and went to the office of the Freedom of Information Coordinator. And I said, I'm looking for the files on the Korematsu and Hirabayashi cases. And he said, well, I'll see if we have them. I had the case numbers, so they would be easier to find. And he came back after a while and said, you know, we can't find them here, but I will keep looking and let you know if we do find them. And I thought, well, gee, I don't know quite what to do. So I went back to Boston and waited. And about a week later, I got a call from the FOIA coordinator. And he said, well, guess what? We found the files. They were in a warehouse out in Maryland, and they'd been misfiled 40 years ago. But if you want to see them, they will be in the reading or the FOIA office at the Commerce Department, because that's where the files had been misfiled. So I went over there, and this is a story I've told many, many times, but it still gives me goosebumps, and sometimes I get even a little choked up. But there were 3 cardboard boxes on a table, and they were all wrapped in twine, old-fashioned twine. And I opened the first box, which said Korematsu on it. And literally the first file I opened up, there were manila files inside the box. The first file I opened up was a memorandum from a Justice Department lawyer named Edward Ennis to the Solicitor General of the United States. His name was Charles Fahey, and he had been an administrator in the Roosevelt administration and was now the Solicitor General. And the memo from, and I'll read you a little bit of it, the memo from Edward Ennis to the Solicitor General said, I'm going to turn a light on and see how that looks. Said that Ennis had gotten these reports from the War Department, from the Army, that the reason for the internment had been the interception of radio transmissions and lights from the coast to Japanese submarines offshore. And Ennis was a little surprised because they didn't add any detail to that. So he contacted the Army intelligence, Navy intelligence, the FBI, and the Federal Communications Commission, and asked them, do you have any records about the interception of messages from Japanese Americans to Japanese submarines? And they said, no, we don't have any. We've checked every report and there's no substance to them. So Ennis wrote in this memorandum to Solicitor General Fahey, he said, one of the crucial points raised in the case, the government is forced to argue that individual selective evacuation would have been impractical and insufficient when we have positive knowledge that the only intelligence agency responsible for advising General DeWitt gave him advice directly to the contrary. I think we should consider very carefully whether we do not have a duty to advise the court of the existence of these reports and of the fact that it represents the view of the Office of Naval Intelligence. It occurs to me that any other course of conduct might approximate the suppression of evidence. Well, the suppression of evidence, as I'm sure you know, is something which is really a criminal offense. But the Solicitor General went ahead and argued to the Supreme Court that the necessity for the internment had been the War Department's finding that they could not separate the loyal Japanese from the disloyal, and therefore they had to treat them all as presumptively disloyal. And Ennis felt that was a terrible thing to say to the Supreme Court. And he added to the Solicitor General, the failure to deal adequately now with this report to the Supreme Court, either by the government or other parties, will helplessly undermine our administrative wording of this footnote. And he says, if we fail to act, this will be a presentation of lies to the Supreme Court. And he urged the Solicitor General not to defend the War Department. They had other constitutional grounds, but Solicitor General Fahey went ahead and, as it said, it is unfair to this racial minority that these lies put out in an official publication go uncorrected. But Solicitor General Fahey disregarded that. He stood up before the Supreme Court and said that he stands behind every line, every word, and every syllable that's in the War Department's report on the internment. And the Supreme Court accepted this without any hesitation because, in fact, they were going to rely on the War Department for the evidence they needed for the internment. Now, as it turned out, they voted 9-0 in 1943 to uphold the conviction of Gordon Hirabayashi. And they voted a year later, 18 months later, in December of 1944, to uphold the conviction of Fred Korematsu for violating the internment order. Now, let me tell you a little bit about these men and how I got involved in the case with them. Gordon Hirabayashi in 1941, at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, was a senior at the University of Washington in Seattle. He was a member of the Quaker denomination, the Quaker meeting in Seattle, and he had volunteered to help people move when they were told that you have to leave your homes and report for internment. And they started the internment. It was a sort of a rolling thing down the coast from Seattle to Portland to San Francisco to Los Angeles to San Diego, so that they weren't all being ordered all at once, but basically a few weeks apart. And Gordon decided that he was not going to report for internment. In fact, he went himself to the FBI office in Seattle and said, I've been ordered to report for internment and I'm not going to go. And here's a paper I wrote about it, a good college paper, why I am not going to report. And so he was then arrested and indicted and convicted and sent to serve his sentence in a prison in Arizona. And Gordon Hirabayashi, who lived in Oakland, California, was born there. both Gordon and Fred, their parents were born in Japan, but they were born in this country and were thus US citizens by virtue of the 14th Amendment. And Fred at that time was working in a defense plant. He had tried to volunteer for the Navy and they turned him away because he was Japanese. And so he got a job in a defense plant welding together ships for the Navy. But when the internment order came for him, his family, his parents, his three brothers reported for internment, but Fred said, I'm not going to go. And at that time, he had a girlfriend who was Italian American, and they decided that they were going to leave California and go inland, probably to Nevada, which was not covered by the internment order, and get married there. But one day, Fred was standing on a street corner in his hometown of San Leandro, right south of Oakland, standing on a street corner waiting for his girlfriend. And up drove a police car, and the cops got out and said, "Are you Japanese American?" And he said, "No, I'm actually Hawaiian American," and showed them a draft card. But he had altered the draft card with ink eraser and put in a Hawaii and a phony name. But they took him to the police station. And eventually Fred said, "Yes, I am. I'm a Japanese American. I'm Fred Korematsu." So they took him to the federal lockup in San Francisco. And then he was tried and convicted and was sent actually to a camp in Utah to serve his sentence. And so they both wound up losing their Supreme Court cases. And they both felt and told me when I first contacted them that they felt sort of ashamed at having pushed this to the point of losing a Supreme Court case that upheld the constitutionality of the internment. But they both went on to regular lives. Gordon became a professor, sociology professor at the University of Alberta in Canada. Fred became a draftsman, working on his own, and they both had families and children, and years passed. And then in the 1970s, the late 70s, there began to be a movement called the Redress and Reparations Movement, which was organized starting in Seattle to pressure members of Congress to support legislation that would do reparations to Japanese Americans who'd been interned. And it was supported by a number of members of Congress, including some very conservative Republicans. Newt Gingrich was one of them. So that was going through Congress, and they set up the commission to start the investigation. Well, when I got a hold of the records in 1981 and discovered that the Justice Department's own lawyers were arguing that they were presenting lies to the Supreme Court to justify the internment, it struck me that there might possibly be some way of reopening these cases, even 40 years later, because of this evidence that had been concealed for the last 40 years. Now, I knew I couldn't do this by myself. In fact, I was still living in Boston at the time, but I was about to relocate to San Diego because I'd gotten a job in the political science department at the University of California in San Diego. And I knew I couldn't do this myself. So the first question I asked myself was, well, I don't even know if these three men, there was another one, Minoru Yasui in Portland, Oregon, but I don't know if these men are still alive. And if so, they'd be in their 60s. I'm not even sure where they live and how to get in touch with them. But I finally contacted one of them, Min Yasui, who was living in Denver at the time. And he said, well, I know some lawyers in California that might be able to help you with this. And he gave me some names, and I contacted one of them, a man named Dale Manami, who was a lawyer in San Francisco, graduate of the University of California Law School at Berkeley. And I just contacted him out of the blue and said, I'm interested in seeing if it's possible to reopen these cases. And he said, this is what we've been waiting for. We've been trying to figure out a way and we haven't been able to yet. And I said, well, I'm thinking of a petition for a writ of error coram nobis. Now, at that time, nobody had ever heard of coram nobis, including virtually all lawyers, because it wasn't even taught in law school. It wasn't taught when I was at Harvard Law School, but I used it myself to overturn a conviction for violating the draft law, because I'd spent 3 years in prison in the 1960s for refusing military service on a number of grounds. And after I had been released and had gone to graduate school and then in law school, I got a hold of my records, the FBI and draft board records, through the Freedom of Information Act, and discovered that I had been drafted a year earlier than I should have been to punish me for my anti-war activities. And this was in the records. And so I looked around in the Harvard Library and discovered this writ of error coram nobis, which can be brought by people who satisfy 3 conditions. First of all, that they had served the entirety of their sentence. They had found records that had not been available at the time of their trial that could have reversed their conviction. And thirdly, that they're still alive and want to do this. And so eventually I contacted all 3. Gordon was the first, and he was very eager to go. He said, I've been waiting 40 years for you to give me a call. And then I met with Fred Korematsu. And this was something that was very, it was a turning point in my life. The meeting I had with Fred in his living room when I went to San Francisco and simply called him up and said, I'm here. Can I come over and meet with you? I'd earlier sent him copies of some of these documents. And he said, well, I'm free this evening. Come on over. So I took a cab over to his house in San Leandro. His wife and daughter, his wife was picking up their daughter at the airport. So Fred and I sat in his living room and I said, I've had these documents and this is what we're basing this on. And if you're willing to go ahead with this, we'd be glad to represent you. And so Fred sat there. I was on his couch and he was in his easy chair, puffing on his pipe, petting his little dog. And he read through these documents without saying a word for about 20 minutes. And I'd highlighted the parts that were most important. And I was sort of nervous because I had no idea what he was thinking. And after about 20 minutes, Fred looked over to me and he said, are you a lawyer? I thought he knew that, but I said, yes, I am a lawyer. And he said, will you be my lawyer? It still gets me. And I said, yes, I'd be very glad to do that. So we put together a team of about 20 lawyers, most of them young Japanese Americans whose parents and grandparents had been in the internment camps. And there were some of us who were not Japanese Americans, Chinese, Filipino, African American. But it was a team that worked for almost a year putting together a petition to the district court, federal district court in San Francisco, and an identical petition for the federal court in Portland for Minoru Yasui, and one for Gordon Hirabayashi in Seattle. And Fred's case went first. And after we submitted the petition, and of course the government was entitled to respond to it, and their response was, well, this was 40 years ago, it was a misdemeanor conviction, and who really cares about this? And we can't go back and revisit the Supreme Court, particularly in this kind of case. Well, when we were in the court, and the judge in the Korematsu case, a woman named Marilyn Hall Patel, She had previously been a lawyer for the National Organization for Women. She was known as being very liberal. We had considered ourselves very lucky to have her draw this case. We thought she would be sympathetic, but you never know. But so we had a hearing, and it was in the largest courtroom in San Francisco, the U.S. Court of Appeals ceremonial courtroom, seated about 300 people, and it was packed. And most of the people there were, a lot of them were elderly Japanese Americans who had been in the camps, and a lot of the others were young Japanese Americans. And so we had an argument that the government had lied to the Supreme Court. We had evidence of the lies, and therefore Fred was entitled to a vacation of his conviction. And at the end of the hearing, after our lawyer, Dale Manami, had given our argument, and after the government lawyer, Victor Stone, had made an argument basically as I just outlined. And so then Judge Patel, and this surprised everybody because it wasn't usual, she said, Mr. Korematsu, and he was sitting right next to me at the lawyer table. She said, Mr. Korematsu, would you like to address the court? And Fred stood up, and we didn't know anything about this. Fred stood up, and I'm going to read you a little bit of what he said. He said, Your Honor, I still remember 40 years ago when I was, where are we? Oh, I still remember 40 years ago when I was handcuffed and arrested as a criminal here in San Francisco. The shame and embarrassment I felt 40 years ago at being escorted to a racetrack to await removal of my family. And he said, the horse stalls that we stayed in were made for horses, not human beings. He said, I thought that this decision was wrong, and I still feel this way. As long as my record stands in federal court, any American citizen can be held in prison or concentration camps without a trial or a hearing. And that was a very emotional point. And then Judge Patel said, I'm ready to render my decision. A written decision will come later, but my decision right now is that I'm granting the petition. He said, Mr. Korematsu, your conviction has been vacated, and I wish you all the good luck. And she got up and exited the courtroom. And at that point, people just erupted into cheers. People were crying. People were hugging each other. People were hugging Fred. And it was a tremendous, I wish they had allowed us to film it. But at any rate, we then later on got the convictions of Min Yasui and Gordon Hirabayashi vacated also by federal judges. And that helped the redress movement in Congress because we had effectively overturned the Supreme Court. This was the first time this had ever been done. Overturned the Supreme Court itself. And so the convictions that upheld the internment were no longer valid. So the redress and reparations bill went through Congress and passed. It involved a payment of $20,000 tax-free to every living survivor of the internment. There were about 60,000 left out of 120,000, and the others had passed away. And if you multiply 60,000 by 20,000, quick math problem, you get $1.2 billion, and which is a lot of money. Although right now in the federal budget, it's just a fly speck. But at any rate, the redress and reparation bill went through. President Reagan at that time signed the national apology. Now, this was a tremendous victory for us, but we also thought that we had more work to do. We'd won our case, but we wanted to educate the American people about what had happened. Our motto was, and we had borrowed this from survivors of the Holocaust, never forget, never forget. what had happened. And of course, as a society, we're very forgetful. We forget the bad things that had happened in the past and tend to dwell on the good things. Well, we'd won the Second World War. And so that was, that made the what the Japanese Americans had experienced, nobody quite remembered it, particularly people who didn't live on the West Coast or weren't alive at the time. And so we've had a campaign since we won this case. This is part of that campaign. The lawyers who worked on the case, including me, have given talks and met with students, high school students, community groups, university students, to tell them what had happened. And in some cases, to show them what had happened through slides, through movies that we had made about the internment cases. And so since I had been involved in this, and it had literally changed my life. I say that the meeting I'd had with Fred, if Fred had said, no, I don't want to do this, it would have been, we could have gone ahead with the second and third cases, but it wouldn't have been the same. And of course, lawyers and law students, one thing Fred said after we had won this case, he said, well, now every law student in the country will know my name, which is true. And so the Korematsu case, the Hirabayashi case, are still on the books of the Supreme Court, but the court has made it clear that they are no longer good law. They cannot be cited as precedent. And they're on the books in the same way that the Plessy versus Ferguson and Dred Scott cases upholding slavery and then the Jim Crow laws are still on the books, but of course they're not good law anymore. So I think with that, I'm going to stop and see what kind of questions or comments people have. I'm not sure how the technology here works, but are we doing okay, Mandy? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. And I think given the technical problems that we had at the beginning, we are doing just fine. Your talk so far was very inspiring, and we have 47 participants. So what people could do, actually, Emily, if you can hear me, Emily is hosting at this point. She's another one of our Columbia County librarians. Emily, if people want to ask questions, can they unmute themselves at this point?
They should be able to.
Excuse me, Mandy. One thing I would like to promotion here. This is the copy. It looks backward on my screen, but this is the copy of the book that I wrote about the internment, Justice at War, the story of the Japanese American internment cases. It's still available in paperback. And I might just add that this book, and I've written a dozen books on the Supreme Court and various cases. A People's History of the Supreme Court is one of them. And this book literally had consequences I never dreamed of, because the research I did for it, of course, made possible reopening these cases. But it also, what the book does is it chronicles what happened, what went wrong, why lawyers stood up before the Supreme Court and knowingly told lies, while Japanese Americans were still behind barbed wire in these camps and desolate places around the country on the West Coast, mostly in deserts, on Indian reservations. And these are people who committed no crime. As Fred once said, my only crime was my ancestry. And this raises a question, I think, that what is it about our ancestry? We all have an ancestry, but what is it about our ancestry that allows us to distinguish ourselves? Well, I belong to this race, the Caucasian race, the white race, whatever you want to call it. Other people belong to the black race, African Americans or Africans themselves. Other people belong to what they used to call the yellow race, people from Asia. But one thing I pointed out to my students all along is that each of us has 20,000 genes, and these genes all have a little purpose, a little job to do in our bodies, whether it's in our brain or our organs or even our skin. And there are only 6 genes out of 20,000 that decide what color our skin will be, which is based on where our ancestors lived 350,000 years ago. And ironically, those of us who say, well, I belong to the white race, and a lot of people say, and therefore we're the superior race. But white people weren't distinguishable by skin color until about 8,000 years ago. People lived in the northern climates in Scandinavia because they didn't get enough vitamin D from the sun's rays, and their skin gradually became lighter so they could absorb more of these rays from the sun. And what difference does it make? 6 genes out of 20,000? And those genes make a difference that we should treat people differently based on them?
No.
And I have to show you something. My kitties are having a fight here. Kitties.
The cats.
Anyway.
So Peter, I think there are some. So I think there are some messages in the chat, and I think Emily was saying that if people want to ask you questions or make comments, certainly it doesn't have to be a question. It could be a comment from your own experience. I know we do have a lot of Japanese Americans who have joined us tonight. So if anyone wants to make a comment, you just have to unmute yourself, and then you can ask the question or make the comment. And then we also have some things in the chat, which either myself or Emily, we could read those out. But let's open the Zoom floor up first for people to unmute themselves. You could either ask Professor Irons, Dr. Irons, a question, or you could share with us.
And I see Tony Okada.
Tony, okay, so Tony is raising his hand. Okay, Emily, do we have to give him?
He should be able to talk there, unmute. No.
Okay. Konnichiwa.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Moshi Moshi.
My question is there a difference between overturning a case versus vacating a case? And does that make a difference as far as going in the future? You said there are cases where vacated, they can't be cited as precedent. It's not good law, but would there be a difference if they had actually overturned the decision?
Well, this is why I said this is the first time the Supreme Court decision has ever been overturned. But technically, it has not been overturned by the court itself. The court could have said, and they said in an opinion dealing with the Muslim travel ban from Hawaii, a case called Hawaii versus Trump, that the Korematsu case is not a good precedent for this case, and we are disavowing the case. They could have said, we hereby overturn our decision. They did not. So we're in the anomaly of having the convictions vacated. That is Fred and Min and Gordon, and they've all passed away by now, but they no longer had any criminal record, even though there's a case in the Supreme Court that upheld their former criminal record. So that's one of these things that lawyers will puzzle over this, but the vacation of the sentence itself means that it's no longer, you vacate something, it's no longer there. And it's the same root as the word vacation. You leave where you are to go someplace else. And but at any rate, as one of the opinions said, the Korematsu case has been overturned in the court of public opinion. And that's what we still are trying to educate people about. In public opinion, the case has been overturned, and we need to make sure, as Justice Murphy said in his dissent in the Korematsu case, which was a 6-3 case. Hirabayashi had been 9-0, but there were 3 dissenters in Korematsu. And Justice Murphy said, in the last case, we went to the very brink of constitutional power. He said, in this case, we have gone past the brink into the ugly abyss of racism. And that was the whole point. The internment came about simply because people who had a different skin color and lived in a different part of the world were considered dangerous simply because of that they would identify with the country which had attacked the United States. It certainly had, but that they would identify and sympathize with that instead of the country in which they were born, 2/3 of them, and the country in which they were legal aliens, but not citizens. The Congress had passed a law in 1910 that said no person of Japanese ancestry can be an American citizen. And this was not overturned by Congress until 1954. So during that whole time, there were people living here that could not become citizens, but were legal aliens. So at any rate, that's my answer to that question. Do we have more?
Looks like, yes, we do. We have
Chizu.
Jim Lynn.
Oh my goodness, I see Chizu Omori. I haven't seen Chizu for years and years, and you look wonderful. Oh my goodness, this is such a treat. Chizu Omori, for those of you who don't know her, do you still live in Seattle? Made a movie. Tell us the title of your movie.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Rabbits was in.
Yeah.
Yes,
Rabbit
we can
in the
hear
Moon.
you.
Rabbit in the Moon is the name of the doc that my sister and I made. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm 93 now, Peter, so I'm one of the last ones standing.
Pardon me?
I'm one of the last survivors.
Well, that's really good for you and for us that you're still with us. As you know, what camp were you in? I just had a cat jump right over my legs. What camp were you in, or camps?
Poston.
In
Poston.
Poston?
Yes.
Poston was in Arizona.
Yeah.
And that's the camp actually that Gordon Hirabayashi was sent to. I don't know if you were there at the same time he was. And of course, you were much younger than he was.
Yeah.
But
Well,
at any rate, why was it necessary to send you to this concentration camp?
you're asking me? I don't know. I was 12 years old and just a farm kid, and I didn't know what was going on. But I have devoted a lot of time to, studying all this stuff, and I'm still with it, with the Wakasa Memorial thing. I don't know if you know about that. That's going on, and then Suited for Solidarity. So, well, I do a lot of talking to classes for kids, or answering email about this, because I feel that not enough is known to the general public, and so that's my role now, to inform and talk about this experience. It changed my life. You and Aiko, and Aiko's husband, what was his name? And William Horry. Oh, mention the Coram Nobis case. I mean, not the Coram Nobis case. The lawsuit, the William Horry
The Endo
versus
case.
United States. Yeah, you should talk about that a little.
Well, let me just since Chizu mentioned this, there was a 4th case that went to the Supreme Court called Endo versus United States, and Mitsui Endo. Mitsui was her first name. She was a government clerk, a state clerk in Sacramento. And when she was in the camp, she filed, with the aid of a lawyer, a habeas corpus petition. And of course, the habeas corpus is one of the ancient writs going back to England 400-500 years ago. And what a habeas corpus petition does, it asks the court, it says, I'm being unlawfully held. Will you hold a hearing and see if there's reason to hold me? And her case dragged on, but eventually went to the Supreme Court and was decided the same time as Korematsu. And it's sort of ironic because in that case, the Supreme Court said she has been, Miss Endo has been already designated by the War Relocation Authority as a loyal American. And as Jizu knows, or at least her parents had to fill out questionnaires. And one of them said, are you willing to bear arms for the United States? And some people said no, because they were either pacifists or they were women or elderly people. And the second question said, do you renounce your allegiance to the Emperor of Japan? And people said, I've never had an allegiance to the Emperor of Japan. And they wrote no. So these were called the no people. And they were all sent to a concentration camp in California, Tule Lake. And so at any rate, in the Endo case, they said, we can't uphold the detention of a loyal American citizen, which is ironic because Fred, of course, had been decided was a loyal American citizen. He was really loyal, tried to enlist in the armed forces to fight for this country. And in fact, there was a battalion called the 449th Battalion. Is that the right?
442nd.
Pardon me?
442nd.
The 442nd, which was made up of of Japanese American men who were already interned in these concentration camps. And I think in case anyone has a question about that, that is a proper term. In fact, President Roosevelt himself used the term concentration camp for these people. I'm sorry, I lost the train of my thought.
Well, Peter, maybe if I can break in here, I just want to make sure that we give Mr. Lynn, Jim Lynn, you've had your hand up for quite a while. Can you unmute yourself? Would you like to comment or have a question?
Sure. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
So, Peter, I don't know if you remember, but I invited you to speak in my course on Asian American Studies at UCSD in 1986. And you were really a turning point in my personal life because I'm of Chinese background and I didn't know any of this story. There's nothing in high school that I learned about this. And then after you spoke, then Min Yasui spoke, and that really transformed the Chancellor Atkinson. After that, before that, he was opposed to any kind of course in Asian American Studies. But after that, he called me and said, I'm going to support Asian American Studies. So that was, it's very difficult to come up with
Well,
I think this is what we watched last night.
that everyone can understand.
The girl gets off the bus and looking.
Yeah.
This is I'm glad to see Jim too. This is sort of like Old Home Week, where people I haven't seen for years. And this is a wonderful way, Mandy, for us all to get together. I see at the bottom of my screen, it just went away. Somebody said it is really great to see Chizu.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can read some of these chats if people would like. We can let me just go through these chats really quickly and make sure there weren't any questions. Let's see. Oh, Fran Sheehan made a comment that I thought was interesting. She said there are similar issues with people of Middle Eastern descent following 9/11 being held unfairly, and that is absolutely right. That happened as well. People are mentioning Guantanamo, situations like that.
Yeah.
Well, one thing, yes. As a matter of fact, the lawyers on our team, the Korematsu and Hirabayashi and Yasui lawyers, We've all been involved in efforts, legal efforts against the internments that have happened since then. I think it's proper to call them internments, unlawful detention of people simply because they were either Muslim. This actually happened with Cubans. They were going to set up internment camps for Cubans in this country because they were possibly dangerous. And now, of course, we have all of the turmoil 20 miles south of me at the
Can you hear
Mexican
this?
border between
I can
San
hear
Diego
something's saying.
and
What you
Tijuana.
doing?
And there are thousands of people who want to come into this country, and they are treated by many people as invaders. That's a term that
You can?
what's his name, Mr. Trump, used to characterize them. And so I think that's even more reason why we have to tell these stories, not only the stories of the Japanese American internment, but also of the way we treat other people. And when I say we, I'm talking about the government and those of us who are not members of those disfavored groups. And it's our responsibility to make sure that coming generations know the history of what happened. And we'll be able to say never again. But that's a hard, that's a hard lesson to learn when there is so much emotion and so much hostility toward people who are considered different. Now, everybody is different from other people, even from your own siblings and parents, for example. We're all individuals. And there was one point I was going to read you where the Navy intelligence that said there's no reason to put them all in camps because we have already identified those who might be dangerous. And it's a very small group, no more than 3%. Right after the Pearl Harbor attack, in fact, the government rounded up about 1,000 Japanese Americans who belonged to Japanese military organizations or Buddhist temples and were considered potentially spies or saboteurs. And all of those people were given hearings. They couldn't have a lawyer, but they had a hearing on their loyalty. And virtually every single one of them was released as being loyal to the United States. And the irony is that a few months later, they were forced, regardless of the finding of loyalty, into these concentration camps.
Yeah.
Peter, I just wanted to mention one more chat that we had here.
Okay.
It's from Renata Shura, and she says, it is extremely moving to hear Chizu speak about the experience. This entire Zoom is extremely moving. I too would like to know what we can do to educate people, like Jim has asked. So
well, one thing people can do is to contact, and it's easy on the internet, Korematsu Institute. Fred Korematsu's daughter, Karen, has set up this institute to promote education about the internment. And they have a whole variety of educational tools, films, books, readings to educate people. And if you just put in korematsuinstitute.org, I think that will connect you. And that's a place I would go. There are lots of others. There is a archive, the Japanese American archive, not only about the internment, but the entire history of Japanese Americans in this country, located in Seattle, and it's called densho.org, DENSHO. Is that correct, Chizu?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, denshu.org. And you can find all sorts of things. You can find interviews with Fred Korematsu, interviews with me, interviews with people who've been in the camps, and all sorts of reading material. And I would suggest both of those sources.
okay.
Can I say one thing about the loyalty questionnaire? I have always wondered, the legality of using something like that to categorize people as disloyal or loyal, and then forcing the disloyal to protest their treatment. And I'm a member of the Tule Lake Committee. Just got back from Tule Lake because we're having docent training for people to lead pilgrimages. We go there and allow people to talk about their experiences. It's been difficult for many to talk about what happened to them because it was so painful, or if you were in Tule Lake, that you would be considered disloyal, so you don't want to talk about it. And so there's many efforts to at least help our community remember what happened to it, and to guard against this ever happening again to any other community.
Yeah. Well, Chizu just made an important point, which is that until the redress movement got started and the commission started holding hearings around the country, over 700 people testified, and there's a huge volume of their testimony in the Dencho archives. But many of these people said, we were so ashamed because the Supreme Court had ruled that we were all disloyal or potentially disloyal. And so we never talked about it. There was a Japanese phrase, and I can't quite remember it right now.
Shikataganai?
Pardon me?
Shikataganai?
Yeah, it meant keep it inside, don't share it, and so people wouldn't talk about it. So I have one little story. When I met Fred and Fred decided to go ahead with the case, Fred told me a story that he said, in fact, his daughter Karen told this story. He said, when she was in junior high school, one of her classes, you had to give book reports. And the only other Japanese American in her class gave a book report about a citizen. It was called Citizen, I forget the number, but it was a book about the internment written by one of the internees. And it mentioned the Korematsu case. And Karen was thinking, the Korematsu case? I wonder, my goodness, I've never heard of it. And so when she got home from school, she asked her dad, she said, Dad, somebody mentioned the Korematsu case. Do you know anything about that? And Fred sort of waited for a second and said, that was me. Karen had never known about this. And that was part of it, that Fred had never talked about it, even with his family. And so what this whole experience did is it wiped away that shame. Now, you can't wipe away your experiences. They're still with you. People remember what it was like in the internment camps, the dust, the heat, the cold, the bathrooms, the mess halls. I can remember episodes when I was in prison, but we tend to look on the bright side. Everybody says, oh, look on the sunny side of life. Well, life is made up of all kinds of experiences, and there's no reason why this experience should not be told to other people. What it did to people in their lives, a lot of people could not recover what they had lost during the internment. Their homes, their businesses, their farms, all taken away from them. So I'm wondering, let me say one last thing. Or can I say one last thing, Mandy?
Yes, of course.
Okay. If anybody wants to contact me and ask a question or ask for, some material that I could refer them to, you can contact me very easily by email. If you can't write it down right now, it's very easy to remember. It's pirons, PIRONS at UCSD.edu, which means University of California at San Diego, UCSD.edu. And I'm more than happy to connect with anybody, answer questions you have. It's been a real delight. I'm so glad that our technical issues got solved. And it's so glad to see you people and my niece, who I haven't seen for quite a while. So-
Peter, what was it? So your email address again is pirons at, oh, there we go. Emily put it in the chat for everyone. So your email address is now in the chat. And I certainly appreciate each and every one of you who stuck with us with our technical problems. We had a Google verification. Google was trying to make sure that we were who we said we were, and it really put us through our paces. So we're very sorry about that, and we're glad that so many of you were able to join the talk tonight. And yeah, so I just want to thank you so much, Peter, for sharing all of your wisdom, and for each and every one of you for participating in the talk tonight. And it is being recorded, so it will go up on our website, which is the Columbia County Library's website. And what I'll do is I have everyone's email address. So I'll send all of you a follow-up message, and I'll send you a link to the recording in case you want to share that with other people. But we really appreciate each and every one of you for, really your interest in this topic. It's such an important topic, and it's so important that we, really, like we've talked about tonight, try to educate people so that it's not forgotten.
Well, I've been very pleased. I sort of wish we could have all meet in person and have a little circle. But at any rate, it's been a great experience, and I thank you all for being part of it. And I look forward to hearing from some of you. And I'll say goodbye. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.